On behalf of WisconsinEye, I want to thank you for allowing us to participate. Thanks to the Press Club, thanks to the Rotary, but the importance is the candidates to my right. 3 weeks from today, we will be electing a U.S. Senator and a governor in a very important office of Attorney General. The Attorney General's office not only advises the three branches of government on legal issues, it defends them, it investigates crime, environmental issues, and civil violations. So I want to introduce both candidates. To my immediate right is Josh Kaul. Trying to get organized here. Thanks, Josh, for your patience. Josh is a private practice attorney in Madison, specializing in voting rights issues. He worked as a federal prosecutor in Baltimore for 4 years. He was raised in the Fox Valley. Attorney General Brad Schimel. He's a Democrat. I forgot that. Attorney General Brad Schimel is a Republican in the race. He's the incumbent. He was elected in 2014. He was elected Waukesha County DA in 2006. He joined that office in 1989, and he's a native of McWanago. The format is, at 1 o'clock, we're going to take questions from you, and I've got questions for each candidate and a couple general questions for both candidates. Each candidate has 2 minutes to respond. And then after that, if further rebuttal, that rebuttal will be short. So that's kind of the format. So, ready? Thank you very much, candidates. Mr. Schimel first, please. You joined the Attorneys General of Texas and other states in suing in federal court in Texas to have the Affordable Care Act declared unconstitutional. If a judge agrees with you today and issues a ruling finding it unconstitutional, wouldn't that allow insurance companies to deny coverage for pre-existing conditions and prevent young adults through age 26 from coverage under their parents' policies? General?
Every person running for legislature in Wisconsin, and frankly running from Wisconsin to be in the United States legislature, every single one of them supports covering people with pre-existing conditions. Wisconsin did cover people with pre-existing conditions before Obamacare undid our state system. Obamacare is unconstitutional. There was a 2012 decision from the United States Supreme Court that said the individual mandate by itself is unconstitutional. The Congress has now removed the tax penalty and left it unconstitutional. My oath is to the Constitution. If a law is unconstitutional, my job is to see that law undone. The job of the legislature is to address the policy side of it to make sure that the policies make sense. We should have the legislature of Wisconsin making these decisions for us instead of a one-size-fits-none system that the federal government's put in place. Obamacare is going to collapse under its own weight. It is a series of broken promises. Rates have gone up, contrary to the promise. In Wisconsin, by average of 42%, insurance rates went up. That's unsustainable. We also saw options for consumers go down. In fact, in 2015, I think it was, PolitiFact declared that President Obama had the political lie of the year when he said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. None of those things have turned out to be true. Options have been reduced. This is bad for Wisconsin. Rates are up. This is bad for Wisconsin. And we still have many millions of Americans who are not covered because Obamacare is failing. It is unconstitutional. My job as Attorney General is to go after unconstitutional laws, and the United States Department of Justice agrees with us. They have conceded that we're right in this lawsuit. Thank you.
Mr. Kaul?
First of all, this lawsuit is weak legally. But it also doesn't serve the interests of Wisconsinites. If this suit is successful, protections will be eliminated for people with pre-existing conditions. Young adults would lose the guarantee that they can remain on their parents' coverage until they turn 26. And this Congressional Budget Office estimates that if the major components of the Affordable Care Act are struck down, more than 30 million Americans will become uninsured. We heard about repeal and replace for a period of time. But there is no replacement plan here. If this law is struck down, there's going to have to be a scramble to figure out what we're doing. But Under the law we have now, we have strong protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I don't think our Attorney General should be fighting to eliminate them. And as Attorney General, I'd seek to withdraw the state of Wisconsin from this lawsuit. I think we should be working to expand access to affordable health insurance coverage here in Wisconsin and working to reduce costs, not fighting to eliminate protections for people who have pre-existing conditions.
Do you want to respond, Mr. Schimel, or I can move on?
It's the job of the legislature, and every person running for the legislature at the state and federal level is promising they will make sure that people with pre-existing conditions are covered. Obamacare is unconstitutional. It should be eliminated and replace it with something that is.
Just a very quick follow-up, General. If the polls show that the race for governor is a dead heat, if Mr. Evers is elected and he asked you to withdraw from that suit, do you have the discretion to withdraw?
In Wisconsin, the Attorney General only has the authority to sue the federal government when either the governor or either house of the legislature authorize them to do so.
Thank you for clarification. Mr. Kaul, your opponent repeatedly says you have never prosecuted a criminal case in Wisconsin. And last Friday's debate, he said you returned to the state 4 years ago. Do you have the experience required to run a justice department with 680 employees and an annual budget of $133 million?
So let me talk a bit about my background. I grew up in Oshkosh and Fond du Lac in a family that was deeply involved in public service. My mom was a prosecutor, an elected official. My stepdad, Bill, was a police officer in Neenah. My mom's parents were both public school teachers in Fond du Lac. And I had the opportunity to spend part of my career in public service as well. I was a federal prosecutor in one of the most violent cities in the country. I prosecuted drug traffickers, gang members, and murderers, and worked to make communities safer. Some of my work involved working to dismantle drug trafficking conspiracies. I think that sort of background and that sort of approach is part of what we need to take on our opioid epidemic right now. I think we need to ensure that our enforcement efforts are targeting large-scale traffickers who are sending drugs like heroin and fentanyl and meth across county lines and state lines. And I'm happy to compare my record as a federal prosecutor with our current AG's record as AG, where we have seen failures on issues relating to public safety, whether it's testing only 9 out of more than 4,000 kits in our backlog of untested rape kits in his first 2 years in office, whether it's increased delays in testing times at the state crime labs, an opioid epidemic that continues to get worse, and suggestions for school safety, like that we consider arming teachers and criticizing gun-free school zones. I think we need an AG who's going to fight for some common sense measures like universal background checks, who believes that we need to start responding to this opioid epidemic like the crisis it is, and who's going to ensure that getting justice for survivors of sexual assault is a priority in our AG's office.
Thank you. Mr. Schimel.
On Sunday evening during our debate, I talked about having 112 public endorsements from district attorneys and sheriffs around Wisconsin. That number's gone up. It is now 114 elected district attorneys and sheriffs that are publicly endorsing me, including over 20 elected Democrat DAs and sheriffs. I have far more Democrat DAs and sheriffs supporting me than Mr. Kaul does. If it were true that the Wisconsin Department of Justice were failing in public safety, I wouldn't have that kind of overwhelming support in this race. They're backing me because they know I have the experience. I've worked in all 72 counties, meeting with public safety and public health officials in every single county. We've talked about the concerns. They've shared with me their ideas, and I've turned those into results by working collaboratively and innovatively. When it comes to the opioid epidemic, we are leaders here in Wisconsin, and I'm leading Wisconsin's challenge on this, but it's a comprehensive approach. My opponent's less than 4 years in a U.S. Attorney's office. He talks about that. He talks about suing the opioid manufacturers. Those are the only two things he said we need to do. That's not the answer. The answer is what we've been doing. We've worked to increase treatment availability. When I took office, there were 29 counties with drug treatment courts in them. Now, thanks to my leadership, there are 51 counties and 2 tribal nations in Wisconsin that have active treatment alternative and diversion courts that are making Wisconsin lives better. We also have an award-winning dose of reality public awareness campaign that is being used in 6 states, both Democrat and Republican states that have taken this on because they've seen the value in this campaign that is raising awareness. Together, we've collected over 400,000 pounds of unused medications. We've seen prescribing of opioids drop by 20% in Wisconsin, thanks to the message that I've been delivering. I have the experience. With 29 years as a prosecutor, I get results, and that's why I'm law enforcement's choice to continue as Attorney General.
On endorsements, I am proud to be endorsed by 61 former assistant AGs. 45 of them signed a letter that says the AG's office is a mess. Those are people who know the office well, and they're supporting my campaign. On opioids, the problem has continued to get worse. We had nearly 900 opioid-related overdose deaths in Wisconsin last year. That's more than a 40% increase as compared to just 2015. I think there are 4 things we need to do more effectively. One is target large-scale traffickers who are sending dangerous drugs across state lines and county lines. But we also need to expand access to treatment far more seriously than we have so far so that people who are addicted are able to get the help that they need to get back on their feet. I do think our AG needs to be serious about holding the pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in this epidemic. And fourth, I think we should expand Medicaid here in Wisconsin. If we do that, about 80,000 more Wisconsinites will be able to be covered under Badger Care and have the health insurance that they need to pay for treatment. And we'd save the state about $190 million a year. We can use that money for a number of things, including expanding access to treatment and reducing health insurance premiums.
There we go. Thank you. Technical issues. Mr. Schimel, I want to follow up. States, cities, counties, local governments have sued big pharmaceutical manufacturers. You haven't. But why?
We are in legal proceedings against the 5 largest opioid manufacturers, and we're doing something that's actually more effective than what these lawsuits can do. Because we're involved in a 22-state multi-jurisdictional investigation being conducted by attorneys general from across America. We're using civil investigatory demands to we have in our hands volumes of reports, evidence that we are looking at right now. The city of Chicago filed their lawsuit against Purdue Pharma in 2014, and they are locked up in court battling jurisdictional motions, and they haven't yet gotten any reports, any evidence. We're already looking at it. We've gotten an agreement signed with all the parties whereby the statute of limitations is frozen. So we've lost nothing. We can drop a lawsuit at any time, but at the same time that we are investigating the companies, we are also at the table pursuing potential settlement, because the lawsuits could lead to getting money, possibly, if they're successful, 8 or 10 years from now. We don't need the help 8 or 10 years from now. We need the help right now. And the opportunity to be in these settlement talks while looking at the evidence at the same time gives us a chance to get money to help us with our prevention efforts, to help us with our treatment efforts, to help us with awareness in Wisconsin, and that will make Wisconsin safer and stronger. This kind of pursuit is why law enforcement is supporting me in this race. It's why I have received multiple awards from the Medical Society, both at the State Medical Society and the Milwaukee Medical Society. The Chiropractors Association gave me an award just 2 weeks ago for our work on the opioid epidemic. Our Dose of Reality campaign has received national awards for its effectiveness in reaching people. We're doing the right thing in Wisconsin. We're turning the corner. We're going to get ahead of this.
So first of all, when it comes to holding the pharmaceutical companies accountable, Mr. Schimel has been AG for over 3.5 years now, so we're not taking swift action here by any stretch. But also, in late 2016 or early 2017, he said he didn't know if the statute of limitations could be stretched back far enough to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable. The good news is that since this campaign started, he's announced that Wisconsin is part of a multi-state investigation. That is a step in the right direction. But his campaign has also taken contributions from political action committees for pharmaceutical companies. I think we need an AG who is committed to ensuring that the pharmaceutical companies are held accountable for their role in this epidemic, and that's what I'm going to do as Attorney General.
Thank you. Back on. Thanks. Appreciate it. Mr. Kaul, the Justice Department will have eliminated the backlog in rape test kits, by the end of this year. Isn't that significant? How would you have cleared that backlog sooner?
So in Mr. Schimel's first year as AG, Wisconsin received millions of dollars to address the backlog of untested rape kits. There were over 4,000 kits that needed to be tested. After he had been AG for 2 years, only 9 of those kits had been tested. And while we have finally made progress, the result of that delay is that there has been a delay in getting justice for survivors of sexual assault, and that dangerous criminals have remained on the streets longer than they should have. We should have brought on more analysts at the state crime labs earlier. We needed them anyway, and Mr. Schimel recently requested funding for additional analysts. We've also had increased delays in DNA testing times. But the result of the delay I was mentioning before is that there has still not been a single person convicted in Wisconsin as a result of our testing of kits in the backlog. We need to make sure that where there are DNA hits, those cases are fully and thoroughly investigated. And we need an AG who's going to ensure that getting justice for survivors of sexual assault is a priority.
Mr. Schimel.
My opponent is demonstrating his lack of experience and his lack of understanding of this problem. 3 years ago, we didn't just get grants. We got the largest federal grants issued in America right here in Wisconsin because of the plan that we put together at the Department of Justice. That President Obama's Department of Justice has recommended other states follow because we put together a victim-centered approach that I knew how to create because of 25 years in the Waukesha DA's office, the largest part of that spent prosecuting sexual assault cases. I was in the sensitive crimes unit for a decade. I prosecuted hundreds of sexual assault cases. My opponent has never worked with a sexual assault victim, much less any victim in Wisconsin. We put together a coordinated approach. In Wisconsin, we had to get 554 law enforcement agencies to work hand in hand with us to resolve this problem. This problem had accumulated over 25 years, and it is done. We resolved this ahead of schedule by the end of August. Every single kit, 4,200 kits were tested right here in Wisconsin. This problem's resolved. There are other states, like Washington State, they just finished counting their kits. We're done. We're moving forward. And we've got, best of all, a plan in place that will guarantee this never happens again. This is a solution. I took my experience to get results, and that's why law enforcement has made me their choice in Wisconsin. If the criticisms my opponent were saying were remotely true, I would not have the overwhelming support of all those district attorneys and sheriffs in our state.
So 2.5 years after we received funding to test these kits, Wisconsin had tested about 2,000. Nevada had tested twice as many, and Portland had tested 3 times as many. We have not convicted a single person in Wisconsin yet as a result of the testing of these kits. And the mission is not accomplished, as my opponent said in our first debate. The goal is not to test these kits, not just to test these kits. It is to get justice for survivors of sexual assault. So we have more work to do to follow up on these DNA hits to make sure we're getting justice in these cases.
I want to come back to an issue that surfaced in Friday's debate because a few of us just might have been watching the Brewers versus Dodgers. Just might have, or out at Miller Park. Let's start with you, Mr. Kaul. You said that the potential of arming teachers would be dangerous. Do you want to explain that?
If we arm teachers, there will be guns in our classrooms. That introduces a danger that isn't present right now. I think that will make our schools less safe. And as Attorney General, I will fight against any effort to arm teachers in Wisconsin. I also support gun-free school zones. My opponent has opened the door to arming teachers in Wisconsin. He has criticized gun-free school zones. We need to make our schools as safe as they can be. I think we need some common sense gun safety measures like universal background checks and a ban on bump stocks. And I also think we need long-term funding for mental health programs in our schools so that schools can hire professionals, counselors, mental health experts. Our current AG has had grant funding to award to improve school facilities, and also they've used to provide training to teachers. And I think those are good steps, but the grant funds were supposed to have been awarded before the start of the school year, and they were not. So I think we need stronger leadership on this, and we need to do more than we're doing right now.
Mr. Schimel. Sorry. Mr. Schimel, on Friday, you laid out a process by which some teachers might be armed. Can you go over that, sir?
Yes, and this is a distraction from the real issue. What I said when asked many months ago was that I think the decision whether to let school personnel carry a weapon should be a local school district decision, not a state government decision. And then I said, if the state of Wisconsin legislature decides to make that move and a local school district, with the support of their voters, decides to permit teachers to be armed, and if any teacher chooses to be armed, I'll train them. That's the extent of what I said. This is a legislative decision. It's distracting from the role of the Attorney General in all of this. Now, we did put something in place that is making Wisconsin schools the safest in America. We had 97% of the public schools in Wisconsin applied for and got grants to make their schools safer by the beginning of August. On February 13th, I was with 400 police chiefs and deputy chiefs from around the state in Wisconsin Dells for the Police Chiefs Association Winter Conference. We heard that night from Michelle Gay, a mom from Connecticut who lost her daughter Josephine in the Sandy Hook Elementary School tragedy. Michelle challenged us. She said, after these school shootings, people argue for months and never do anything, and she's right. She challenged us to do things where you can get consensus and start moving the ball forward to make our schools safer. So the next day, when the tragedy of Parkland, Florida happened, we had a plan and we were ready to work together. And within days, we had a plan to the governor and legislature that they passed in a matter of a couple weeks that got $100 million distributed to our schools, not just for physical improvements, but under our plan, we're also improving mental health awareness and services in our schools that will make our schools the safest in America long term. We're the only state doing this.
My opponent sort of goes back and forth on whether the AG should be involved in legislation. He said that arming teachers is a legislative matter, but then he said that he helped pass this legislation. The bottom line is our AG should be fighting against any efforts to arm teachers in Wisconsin and should be an advocate for gun-free school zones. And we should be advocating for some common sense measures like universal background checks. That's how we're going to make our schools as safe as they can be.
Steve, if I may, please. The legislature argued about universal background checks all the way to the end of the session this last time around. They didn't get anywhere. And I bet you they'll pick up that argument again when they come back in session. While they argued, we put together a plan at the request of the governor. We put together a plan that is making our schools safer now. They can argue all they want. We got consensus on something that's making a difference.
Yeah, I don't think our AG should sit on the sidelines because there's an argument in the legislature. If we want to pass effective measures for public safety, our AG needs to step up and advocate for them, and that includes universal background checks.
New subject. Mr. Kaul, Mr. Schimel got created an Office of Solicitor General. That's the office, those are his assistants who sued on affordable care and other issues that you've mentioned. How would you keep the Office of Solicitor General if you're elected, number one? Number two, if you would, how would you use it?
So I think having an Office of Solicitor General makes sense. I think having a person who's identified as the chief appellate attorney at the Wisconsin Department of Justice makes sense. But I would take a different approach to that office than our current AG has. My approach is for getting involved in challenges to federal laws or policies is that, number one, is this a policy that's harming Wisconsinites? And if it is it unconstitutional or illegal? Do we have a strong legal challenge? And if the answer to that is also yes, then I think the state should get involved. I think that the actions that Mr. Schimel has brought against the federal government are inconsistent with that first question, is this harming Wisconsinites? He's challenging the Affordable Care Act, arguing that it should be invalidated. a suit that, if it's successful, would eliminate protections for people with pre-existing conditions. He's challenged environmental protections. He got the state involved in a lawsuit challenging a rule that guaranteed overtime pay for people who make between about $23,000 and $47,000 a year and put in the hours. So he's fought against overtime pay for middle-class families in Wisconsin. I don't think that that serves the interests of Wisconsinites. I also think we have more resources in our Solicitor General's office than we need right now. I would like to move a couple positions from the Solicitor General's office into criminal litigation so that we have more folks who can work on some of the public safety challenges we face, including the opioid epidemic.
Mr. Schimel.
Our Solicitor General's office is wildly successful. I've attracted one of the most potent teams in America, with 2 former U.S. Supreme Court clerks, 3 others who are former U.S. Court of Appeals clerks. These are all very capable attorneys who are representing Wisconsin effectively. They're undefeated in the last term of all the courts, federal and state courts, in which they appeared. They have led the charge on things like battling the unconstitutional Clean Power Plan that we wrote the brief that convinced the United States Supreme Court to do something they've never done in history. They stopped a regulatory rule on an injunction before there was ever a trial in the lower court. That's how powerful and persuasive our arguments were to the United States Supreme Court. We've gone up to, and we defend the law and we defend Wisconsin. I agree that the reason we should get involved in a lawsuit against the federal government is when there is unconstitutional action or the regulatory agency's gone beyond the authority that Congress has granted to it. So something illegal, and then there's a clear interest for Wisconsin. That's what we've done. We've led over and over on these things. We have stopped things that would have cost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs in Wisconsin, would have led to huge costs for our farmers in Wisconsin, and would have caused things like the franchise rule, which would require individual franchise owners to be subjected to the same rules that a large corporation would. It would have destroyed many, many jobs in Wisconsin. We did things that have made Wisconsin safer and stronger, and I'm proud of the work we've done.
New subject. Wisconsin has the highest incarceration rate of African Americans in the nation. Do you see addressing that as part of the Attorney General's job description? Mr. Schimel, I think it's your turn to go first.
I do believe that it is part of my responsibility as Attorney General to address who is going to our prisons. And the way to do that isn't by, as some have proposed, releasing people who are there convicted from prison. That doesn't make sense. But there are things we are doing on the front end that can make a difference long term. Forever, our criminal justice system has believed that if you just separate a person from their problems for a while, they'll come out better. They'll be rehabilitated and they won't commit the crimes again. We finally learned that when it comes to behavioral health issues like substance abuse disorder or behavioral health issues, they don't get better from confinement. That's why I've helped lead the charge to create treatment alternative and diversion courts in Wisconsin and made a difference. In Waukesha County, I helped make the first alcohol treatment court in Wisconsin a huge success. In Waukesha County, I led the team that created one of the earliest drug treatment courts in Wisconsin. And as Attorney General, we've almost doubled the number of drug treatment courts in the state of Wisconsin. That's where we can make a difference. By finding people who are struggling with substance abuse disorder, struggling with mental health issues, get them help for their problems and divert them from the system. Because right now we have a huge percentage of people in prison who are there with mental health and substance abuse problems. We need to put violent criminals in prison, work to get help for those people who we can get help to, and that's what we are doing now effectively in Wisconsin, with $6.5 million in grants that I administer at the Department of Justice every year to help that happen.
So there are 2 things I think we need to consider when we're talking about potential reforms to our system. Number one, is this law going to keep the public safe, or will it make us safer? And if the answer to that is yes, is a change going to make the system fairer? And if it does both of those things, then that's a reform that I think that we should take a hard look at. And there are a number of things that I think we can do to improve our system. Number one, as I touched on before, is I think we need to significantly expand access to substance abuse treatment here in Wisconsin. Our opioid epidemic has been devastating for families around the state, and we have a growing meth problem. So I think we need to get people the help that they need so they can get back on their feet. I agree with Mr. Schimel that we need to invest in programs that are diversion programs, mental health courts, drug courts, veterans courts. But I think we need an AG who's going to advocate for far more funding for those programs than we have right now. I also think we should be doing more community policing and prosecution. I think that law enforcement is most effective when people in law enforcement know people in the communities where they're working, and vice versa. In neighborhoods in Milwaukee, where community prosecution and policing programs have been used, those programs have been successful. I think we need more of that in Wisconsin.
This is my last question before we go to your questions. If you're elected Attorney General on November 6th, I want both of you to name the 3 top goals you would want the Justice Department to achieve by the end of your 4-year term. Mr. Kaul, it's your turn.
Number one, we need to start doing more to address the opioid epidemic. We need to get overdose deaths in Wisconsin to start dropping. There were nearly 900 in Wisconsin last year. As I said before, I think we need to start responding to this epidemic like the crisis it is. Second, I think we need to ensure that we are doing what we can to make getting justice for survivors of sexual assault a priority. That includes making sure that any DNA hits from our backlog of untested rape kits that have now been tested, that any DNA hits are fully and thoroughly investigated. It also means addressing the increased delays in testing times at our state crime labs. There's been a significant increase in DNA testing time since Mr. Schimel was elected AG, and I think we need to address that. And then third, I think we need to do more to make our schools safer. We certainly should not be arming teachers or getting rid of gun-free school zones. What I think we should be doing is enacting some common sense gun safety measures like universal background checks.
Number one, and my top priority as district attorney in Waukesha County and as Attorney General has been our drug epidemic. It's driving everything. Increases in theft, identity theft, burglary, robbery, human trafficking. It's even driving increases in crimes against our seniors because you have young people, well, middle-aged people too, who are struggling to pay for their addiction and they're victimizing their parents and their grandparents. Second kind of leads me into a second thing that's a top priority for me going into the second term, and that is to continue the work we've been doing with our Elder Abuse Task Force that we launched over a year ago that has partners from across Wisconsin from all of the different organizations, agencies, disciplines, professions that work with our seniors. One of the frustrations I had as a prosecutor over the years was how difficult it was to bring cases involving seniors who are victims to justice. Because unlike children, when I prosecuted people for abuse of children, those children actually got to be better witnesses with time because they matured. They got treatment to help them. They were separated from the offender. They could be a better witness as time went by. With our seniors, it doesn't work that way because they're chosen because they're vulnerable, and as they get older, they'll become a less valuable witness to us, and we often couldn't bring justice. We've got a whole string of legislative proposals that we've worked up as a team that we'll be bringing to the legislature to try to resolve this problem. And finally, I do agree that the school safety issue is important, and we are growing mental health awareness and services in our schools, and we're going to continue to make the Office of School Safety a vibrant, living thing that's going to continue to make our schools the safest in America long after all the grant money has been spent by the schools that have it.
This is part of the program where the moderator apologizes to the candidates. I didn't give them a chance to do opening statements. So here's how we're going to fix that. We're going to take 10 minutes of questions from you, and then each candidate is going to have 2 minutes of closing statements. Questions from the audience, please. Sir. Stand up and loud, please.
First, do you believe in climate change? And second, if you do, what role does the AG have in protecting Wisconsinites from its peril?
Climate change, and what role might the Department of Justice have in that? You took the first question. I think it's your turn to go first, Mr. Schimel.
I believe the climate is ever changing. Yes. To what degree human beings influence that? I'm not a scientist. As Attorney General, I defend the laws and the policies passed by our legislature. I'm not going to dictate to Wisconsin how they should address that. I care about our environment deeply. I've lived my entire life in Wisconsin. One of my favorite places in the world is our family cabin up in Vilas County, where we go, and I love the outdoors. I've worked hard as Attorney General to protect our environment. A very undertold story over the last couple years has been the great work we've done at the Department of Justice on the environment. In 2017, we had the best year in the history of the Department of Justice for economic recoveries in environmental cases. Never before did we bring in as much money as we did, and we did it in a way that helped keep employers, keeping people working here, while ensuring that they cleaned up the mess that occurred and made sure that the problems wouldn't happen again. I'm proud of the work we've done on that, and that's, as Attorney General, that's an important part of my job.
I'm not a scientist either, but I believe in science, and I know that the overwhelming consensus among scientists is that our climate is changing due to human causes. So I do believe that climate change is real, and I think we need to have an Attorney General who's going to acknowledge that. And it's, we heard the AG talk about his challenge to the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was a significant effort to try to start addressing some of the effects of climate change. Mr. Schimel fought against that. So I think that our AG, first of all, shouldn't be fighting against significant efforts to address climate change, but we also need effective enforcement of our environmental laws here in Wisconsin. We just have not had that under our current AG. The fines that have been collected from polluters have dropped dramatically under Mr. Schimel, even compared to his Republican predecessor. I believe that when a company breaks the law and makes a mess in Wisconsin, it should expect to be held accountable in the same way that anybody else who breaks the law is held accountable. In 2018 in Wisconsin, no parent should have to worry about the safety of the water that their kids are drinking.
Another question from the audience, please. Wayne.
Both of you had partisan identification. What difference does party affiliation make in how you do or you would run the office of Attorney General?
One of you in ours, one is a D. What difference does that make as you would administer the Department of Justice?
So first of all, I think that the approach that our AG should take shouldn't be partisan. I think there's no question that Mr. Schimel and I have some different priorities, and that probably is part of the reason that he's a Republican and I'm a Democrat. I wouldn't be involved in a challenge that could eliminate protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I think that our environmental laws need to be seriously and even-handedly enforced. I think we need an AG who's going to meaningfully enforce our consumer protection laws. Those are some examples. But when it comes to actually enforcing the laws, partisanship can play no role in the work of the AG's office. I believe under our current AG, we have seen too often special interests and partisan interests put ahead of the best interests of Wisconsinites, and I think that needs to change.
So I've been 29 years as a prosecutor in Wisconsin. When I was elected district attorney, it was a partisan race. When I was elected Attorney General, it was a partisan race. I believe positions like sheriff, district attorney, attorney general don't fit the partisan labels very well, because if we're doing our job right, we enforce the law the way it's written. We defend the law based on the Constitution. That's what I've done. I've defended Wisconsin law, whether I like it or not. And I'm always thrilled when I say that. Oftentimes members of the media will ask me, can you give us an example of a law you didn't like? And I'm always glad when they ask that, because it means we did our job effectively. If you can't tell which one I didn't like, then we did our job right. I'll tell you one that we took all the way to the United States Supreme Court to defend and won. in the Murr case, a private property rights out of St. Croix County. We defended a Wisconsin law that I thought was terrible and won at the United States Supreme Court. Fortunately, the Wisconsin legislature has since changed that terrible law, and so now I feel like I can talk about that one. When it comes to public safety, there's absolutely no partisanship in it. That's why I have the bipartisan support of the elected district attorneys and sheriffs across the state, because they've seen I put aside the politics and we focused on public safety, on answers that make Wisconsin safer and stronger. And we're having great results. But it takes experience to be able to lead that team. And as district attorney, I led the team in a bipartisan way. We've led the team in a bipartisan way from the Department of Justice as well. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Schimel talked about taking partisanship out of the office, but I mentioned before that 45 former assistant AGs who had served over 900 years in the Department of Justice signed a letter calling the AG's office a mess. And one of the things they pointed to was the partisanship that currently exists in the AG's office. I'm proud to have the endorsement of 61 former assistant AGs, people who know the office very well.
I've got to respond to that, please, Steve.
Yes, sir.
Those 45 attorneys general, former attorneys general assistant attorneys general that signed that letter, over 70% of them signed the recall petition against Governor Walker. 40 out of the 45 have Democrat Party donor histories. That is the most partisan thing you could have said in response to this question.
And I think we have time for one more question before the combination of opening and closing because of my error. Gentleman in the red sweater, sir.
Yes, all the surveys indicate nationally, and I'd like to have both of you comment on what it means to Wisconsin, that immigration is a big issue, and from a crime standpoint, drugs, people trafficking, etc. How many illegal people do we have in the state of Wisconsin, immigrants, and what is your position on sanctuary cities or things like that?
Now, that's a huge, huge issue. There's a lot of elements there. Immigration is a federal issue. Josh, your thoughts on any parts of that four-part query?
So, as Steve just said, immigration enforcement is handled by the federal government. I think that, I personally don't like the way that our federal enforcement efforts have shifted. I think that the federal government's immigration enforcement should target people who we know to be dangerous because they have committed violent crimes or drug trafficking crimes in the past. So for the most part, that's a federal issue. Now, I do think that the AG should be willing to speak out when there are bad policies in place, policies that are harmful. So when the Trump administration put the family separation policy into place at the border where parents were being separated from their kids, more than 20 AGs signed a letter calling for an end to that policy. I thought that policy should be ended. Our current AG was asked about it and said he wanted to move on to other issues. I think the rescission of DACA is also a policy that is not in the interests of Wisconsin. It's not in the interests of law enforcement. And again, I think our AG should be willing to speak out against that. We haven't had that from our current AG, and I think we need an AG who will.
General?
In 25 years in the Waukesha DA's office, I prosecuted people based on what they did, not on who they were or where they were from. It didn't matter to me whether you were an American citizen or an immigrant. I would prosecute you based on the offense you committed, and we would seek judgment from the court based on what you did, not based on your immigrant status. Now, there are two important issues that need to be distinguished as we talk about immigration, and I'm disappointed in both parties in our United States Congress for how they have demagogued the immigration issue. We need immigrants in Wisconsin. The farmers, manufacturers, service companies that I talk to, all of those employers tell me they absolutely need an immigrant workforce in Wisconsin. I wish that our United States Congress would reach some agreement that makes America have a rational, fair and just immigration policy. Border security is a separate issue. If we do not secure that border, the drugs that are poisoning our communities will continue to flow in more potently, more abundantly, and cheaper. You can get high on methamphetamine for $5. And now, because it's so cheap from south of the border, we get over 95% of our methamphetamine comes from Mexico now. We don't make very much of it in Wisconsin anymore. It's good that we don't have the labs here, but the methamphetamine coming from Mexico is more powerful, it's more addictive, it's cheaper, it's destroying more lives. That border needs to be secured. Those are two separate issues that I wish our United States Congress would address.
Again, I want to apologize to both candidates for not giving a chance for an opening statement. So let's give each 2 minutes for a closing statement. General Schimel, first.
Well, first off, thank you, Steve, WisconsinEye, and the Milwaukee Rotary Club for hosting this event. I spent about 10 years in the Waukesha Noon Rotary Club. Unfortunately, I couldn't continue that membership when I became Attorney General because I can't make lunch meetings or breakfast meetings. I am a Paul Harris Fellow, and I have my Paul Harris Fellow pin on today. I've spent my entire life living in Wisconsin. So has my wife of 22 years. There's no place else we would have considered raising our two daughters who are now teenagers. This is a wonderful place to live. My opponent, by contrast, has only lived 4 years of his adult life here. Most of his adult life, he has lived on the east and west coast. He came back to Wisconsin just 4 years ago. I'm proud to be in my 29th year as a prosecutor in Wisconsin representing the people of Wisconsin. My opponent talks about being a former federal prosecutor. The truth about this is he spent less than 4 years in a U.S. Attorney's office on the East Coast. I spent 29 years as a prosecutor. He's had less, according to federal court records, he's had less than 29 cases assigned to him. I've led in Wisconsin. I have trained thousands of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and victim advocates in trauma-informed investigations when conducting sexual assault and child abuse investigations. I helped create Wisconsin's first full-service child advocacy center. I helped create our state's first victim impact panel for intoxicated drivers. My opponent was in middle school when I did that. I've got the experience in this race. I've gotten results, and that's why I'm law enforcement's choice. That's why 114 elected sheriffs and district attorneys from both parties are endorsing me to continue to make Wisconsin safer and stronger as your Attorney General, and I'd be honored to have your vote. Thank you.
Well, let me echo what Mr. Schimel said at the start of his statement. I want to thank you, Steve, for moderating this debate. Thank you to the Milwaukee Rotary for hosting. I grew up in Oshkosh and Fond du Lac. I grew up in a family that was deeply involved in public service. My mom was a prosecutor and elected official. My stepdad, Bill, was a police officer. My grandparents were public school teachers in Fond du Lac. I played fullback on the Fondy Cardinals football team, and I was the first baseman on the baseball team. I'm proud to have worked as a federal prosecutor in one of the most violent cities in the country, where I prosecuted drug traffickers, gang members, and murderers working to dismantle drug trafficking conspiracies. I'm also a dad. I'm a husband. And I want my family and families across the state to live in a Wisconsin that is safer and stronger than we're on track for right now. And there is a lot that an effective Attorney General can do to help us move in the right direction. You didn't hear too much in my opponent's closing statement about his work as AG. We have had failure after failure on issues from the AG's office, whether it's mishandling of our backlog of untested rape kits, seeing the opioid epidemic continue to get worse, having a school safety plan that doesn't include common sense gun safety measures, or weak environmental and consumer protection enforcement. We need new leadership in our AG's office. We need an AG who's going to be a leader when it comes to fighting crime and getting justice for Wisconsinites, who's going to be serious about effectively and even-handedly enforcing our environmental and consumer protection laws, and who's going to be independent and a watchdog for Wisconsinites, who's going to stand up against public corruption, who's going to ensure that Foxconn lives up to the terms of the deal that it struck, and who's going to stand up for the rights and protections of Wisconsinites. Thank you very much.
Before Ed closes us, would you join me in thanking the candidates for Attorney General, Brad Schimel and Josh Kaul?
Thank you, General Schimel. Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Thank you, Mr. Walters, for being here with us today. Rotary is an international leader in the effort to eradicate polio. We've been at it for about 3 decades, and we're 99.9% toward eliminating this dreaded disease from the face of the earth. In honor of your being here today and in gratitude of your time, we'll make a donation to purchase 50 doses of the polio vaccine in each of your names, so we're that much closer to a polio-free world. Thank you for joining us today. 3 quick announcements before we adjourn. The Environment and Ecology Committee meets in room 413. Scholarship Golf Classic Committee meets in room 415. And the Rotary Person of the Year Committee meets in the Rotary office. On the way out today, please stop by the registration table and sign up for one or more of our upcoming events. And Rotarians, you can still pick up a copy of our 2018-2019 club roster. Next week, join us for our annual United Nations Day program to hear from Sheba Crocker, CARE USA's Vice President for Humanitarian Programs and Policies. She will address the United Nations' enduring relevance in a time of global shifts. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today. We are adjourned.